Welcome to today's session, and we're going to continue in the book of 1 Timothy and in chapter 5. Paul continues instructing Timothy, who at this time is in Ephesus. In chapter 5 and in verse 1, Paul says, "Let you not be quick to strike or to stroke upon an elder." That means not to be ready to stroke or hit with strikes or stripes, to smite with blows or with words unto a man who is older in age than you. And remember, at this time we've already read where Timothy was a young man. When Paul writes, "let you not," that is a polite command or a very strong suggestion advising Timothy how he should behave himself regarding this topic. An elder man or woman in this context is referring to someone who is older in age than Timothy. Other older men and women should have knowledge, more wisdom, dignity, etc. relative to God and the things of God. They should be elders in service to and for God and for the Lord Jesus Christ. However, in this context that we're reading here, Paul is talking about those who are not behaving correctly. And so he's instructing Timothy how he should approach those who are older in age than he is, the elder men or women. And we saw back in chapter 4 and in verse 14 where Paul called himself as an elder with respect to Timothy. "Let you not be quick to stroke upon an elder, but on the contrary, you must encourage an elder man as a father, exhort him in the appropriate, respectful manner, as though he were your father. You must encourage the younger men as brothers. You must encourage the elder women as mothers. You must encourage the younger women as sisters." And how would that be? In all purity. So that would be within the sphere of action of every pureness. A pure state, not being contaminated by anything that would be bad from God's point of view, even though it may be in your vicinity, Timothy, in Ephesus at that time. But Timothy's behavior towards the elders and other holy people should be in all purity. Encourage them as though they were members of your own family, not being detached from them as though they were strangers. Paul continues in verse 3, and he says, you must honor widows, specifically the women who actually, truly are continuing being widows. Esteem them according to their holding worth, or their price, their value in the community of holy people. Back in the book of Acts, chapter 6, Luke wrote about a problem that existed at that time, which was about 32 or 33 AD, regarding widows and how they were being treated among the holy people in the church. And that problem was solved in a godly manner. And you can take time to look at that in Acts chapter 6. As Paul is writing here to Timothy, it seems that this problem has arisen again. And of course the time when Paul was writing to Timothy was about 67 AD. The women who were bereaved of their husbands were not being properly cared for during the day-by-day ministerial duties or functions of service among God's people. This would have involved the men taking on the responsibilities, both legally and administration-wise, regarding the finances, the estates, the properties, the young children of these widows. Because in that culture when Paul was living, it was not appropriate for the women to deal with these matters by themselves. They had to rely on a male relative or a male friend to do these things for them, unless, of course, that widow would have an older son, and that son then would take on the responsibility among that family to take care of and carry out this duty and function. So Paul continues teaching Timothy how he should behave and how he should teach others in Ephesus at this time. He says, if a particular widow has children or grandchildren, any offsprings or dependents, progenies, then these progenies must learn firstly to reverence their own house. They must become informed intellectually as students, learn, first of all, to demonstrate good reverential respect towards or for the household people belonging to them. We saw this word reverence previously in chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 3, verse 16, and in chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. And ultimately, reverence refers to the service to and for God, our Father. Paul writes here, though, regarding the progenies or the children, they must learn firstly to reverence their own house and to give away requitals to their parentages. In other words, to give from themselves, to pay back what is due or obligated in return, in the good sense, to their parents, or it could be their grandparents, their ancestors who are still living. In truth, this is acceptable before God. To do and live according to what Paul is writing here to Timothy is being received by God. It's welcome in the sight and presence of God. Paul writes, the really being widows, or those widows who really are widows. So the really being widow is one who not only is bereaved of her husband, but she has been left alone and continues alone, or by herself without progeny to support her, and perhaps her progeny may refuse to support her. And also this widow would be one who hoped and continues to hope on God. She is relying, her expectation of something to happen at a future time rests on what God says. And she remains or stays with supplications. She continues to pray specific communications towards God, making known her needful requests, beseeching God regarding her lack in her situation and circumstance, and the prayers. So she continues to pray to God, to communicate to God regarding her general existence, her general living of life. She's praying to God. And we saw both of these words, supplications and prayers, in chapter 2 and verse 1. So a really being widow, or one who is really a widow, is not only bereaved of her husband, but she is alone. She has hoped on God, and she continues to hope on God. And she remains with supplications and prayers during the nighttime and the daytime. In other words, all the time regarding all of her situations and circumstances and everything. And Paul is letting Timothy know that this widow is one who is to be taken care of by the church of holy people, even though they're not related perhaps to many of the holy people in that church. The church of holy people are to take care of this widow. And we'll see further regarding this in verse 16 as we progress here in chapter 5.